Welcome to Pondering AI. I'm your host, Kimberly and Melissa, and today I'm so pleased to be joined by Melissa Sariffodeen. Melissa is an educator, an entrepreneur, and founder of the Digital Potential Lab. We're going to be talking about the promise or the myth of digital transformation, why AI seems so inordinately disruptive, and if it really is, and why unlearning might be the key for us as individuals and as organizations to transform productively with AI or other technologies. So welcome, Melissa.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
So let's start with a little bit of your background. Maybe you can give us a quick synopsis and tell us a little bit about the work with the Digital Potential Lab.
Yeah, it's great. So I was like, where do you start? I've spent the last just over a decade teaching technical skills to hundreds of thousands of people across Canada, and focusing on anything from an introduction to web making to AI, which we actually started teaching back in 2017 when it was niche. Now we can never imagine where those skills have taken us and that knowledge has taken us. And really, the Digital Potential Lab is something I started the last year or so that really focuses on building, collaborating, and investing in technology, and more specifically, the people who build technology. And my whole sort of premise and what I want to do is help people build things that matter. And I think we need the skills that underlie that. In addition to that work, I also teach leveraging information technology at the Ivy Business School, one of Canada's top business schools, and really have an opportunity to support undergraduate students that way as well.
Mm-hmm. Now, we've been talking about digital transformation for a very long time, and you've been teaching technology skills about information, the use of information and knowledge. Mm-hmm. But despite all of that, and despite the narratives to the contrary, this still seems to remain a really difficult task for most organizations. Mm-hmm. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, that's such a good question. And I mean, I use this example, and when I speak to individuals, I actually tell a personal story where this was a bit of an aha for me, that I think helps maybe to explain some of this. And so I'll keep it really short, but really I started doing this work under Canada Learning Code, was really under Ladies Learning Code. We were teaching adult women technical skills. There weren't opportunities that were welcoming to us, and we started to run workshops. We really early on realized we needed to also support young girls. So we started running summer camps. And I remember it was one of our first summer camps back in 2013, where we had a group of girls ages 8 to 13 come together to learn an introduction to coding. But it was summer camp. So it was fun. We did crafts. We were outside. We did all the things you'd expect for our summer camp. And it was that first day, just before the girls started coding, they were in the classroom, and this young girl, 8 years old, comes crying out of the room, sobbing uncontrollably. And, I run over, I'm wondering what's happening. And she says, "I don't want to do coding. I'm not going to be good at it. My parents are going to be disappointed." And I remember thinking wow, this 8-year-old girl already at a fun summer camp doesn't want to try this thing she doesn't think she'll be good at or has never done before. What is going to be in store for her future? Not to mention all of the adults that have been, living their life for much longer. And so I think at the end of the day, it's really this mindset and the kind of accumulation of beliefs, knowledge, and skills that we have about ourselves that creates this barrier, this resistance. And we can kind of get into it at an organizational level, an individual level. But that story for me was the aha that put me on this question of why is it that some individuals thrive during periods of change and others don't? And this young girl, Taylor, for me was that critical incident that got me on this path.
So and feel free to take this at the organizational or maybe at the individual level, and we'll build it back up to organizations. As you think about that anecdote, although anecdotes should be funny, and that's really kind of sad.
Relevant, relatable, I guess. Yeah.
It is. Yeah. What are those kind of primary barriers or roadblocks as individuals think about moving forward, learning something new, doing something different that you have found to be most impactful or meaningful?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. And I think for individuals and organizations is really similar, right? There's these desire for us to be right? Desire to please, to desire to have control. We don't like uncertainty. We don't like ambiguity. I think we've all lived through the last couple of years where we've seen that firsthand. So it's very similar. And then I think the other parts or barriers that exist are, at least at an organizational level, the incentives that we add on top. So we really value outcomes and particular goal as opposed to the process to get there, right? We sometimes, as much as we want to have strategic clarity, lack it, or we lack the communication of that across teams. And so if any path will take you where you're going, you're going to take any path. And I think that ends up, reinforcing this idea of doing things the way they've always been done, which then reinforces your bias, your beliefs. There's no reason to question or do things differently. And so it's all of these things, from like human quirks to the incentive and the structures that we put in place intentionally or not, that just kind of keep reinforcing these deeply held beliefs, knowledge, and skills that we have about ourselves or our capabilities.
So we hear everywhere that AI is fundamentally different. It's going to change things, and it's by definition disruptive, and therefore we should expect all things in the way that we work, the way that we interact, the way that we think of ourselves as humans to fundamentally change with the introduction of this tech. So I suppose the question is, or maybe it's two, because I can't seem to hold myself to one ever, but is AI fundamentally different in your opinion, your experience? And B, is the presence of a new tech enough to sort of lead to a different outcome or, change the path we're on?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think, I'm not the technical expert. So, there's probably like a whole debate there. I think what I'm seeing, though, is that the pace of change we know is absolutely faster than it's ever been before. That's different. The types of individuals and roles that are being impacted are very different than they have in past digital, advancements or transformations. And so I think those two things are like really important to underscore when I, at least in my line of work, which is the people side of technology advancement. And so I think those make it very, very different. I think there are also technical components, and we can, I'm sure, get into that a little bit more, that do make AI specifically, I think, really different than the technologies we've seen before, or at least the possibility and the potential than we've seen before. And I think I wanted to jump on something you said around disruption, because, it is a bit of a buzzword. I really like to think about a particular model of disruption. And it's by the scholar Joshua Gans. It builds on Clay Christensen's model of disruption. Some of the listeners here might be familiar. It's a very, well talked about model. But it's this idea that disruption, and sort of what they would say is supply side disruption, really comes from within. And I think that's the part that AI is so different than maybe advancements in the past, is that it requires a very fundamental shift in the way that we put together the business strategy, processes, and the people than we've seen before. Yes, we can, augment, or I think in your words, refactor maybe, and think about AI that way. But if we're really going to get at the root of the transformational power it has, it does require us to put the pieces together. And that's the part that's disruptive. It's not necessarily that organizations can't see it or aren't working to make the shift. It's that it changes the entire architecture or the entire fabric of a way an organization runs and even thinks about its work. And I think that is what's very different than maybe cloud or some of the technological advancements we've seen in the past.
We say that. We certainly see that out there. It's not entirely clear to me at this point that that's necessarily how we're approaching this. We can look at even something like generative AI, and we talk about that as fundamentally transforming how humans work, giving you a digital assistant. Yeah. But when we then, so on the one hand, there's that, it sort of changes everything, and yet it's largely being applied to grease the skids, or maybe it's to augment some of how we do existing tasks, but really it is still in the context of an existing task, right? And you get these kind of crazy conversations like, well, hey, we can still have all these meetings and we'll send our avatars, which,
yeah,
why? Maybe you're not actually asking why you have the meeting, right? That it seems nonsensical to me to send two avatars to have a meeting and churn out some notes. Or we're looking at a process and we'll use, the generative AI tool to maybe create an outline or to summarize something or to create an initial graphic. It doesn't, though, or at least I haven't seen examples where people are thinking about transformation in a more wholesale way. So I suppose the question is, questions, because again, can't seem to hold myself to just one here. Have you seen an example of what's really a wholesale transformation within an organization? And whether you have or have not, you mentioned some components about really thinking about strategy and process differently. What would that actually look like?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think that, I've used this analogy before with kind of the way that we think about AI maybe as being icing on the cake. And I think your examples there, having your otter take meeting minutes, notes, transcribe them, send them out, that's really like the sort of superficial icing on the cake, where I think where we can go is that we see AI as the flour baked with inside the cake. And that idea that it is sort of AI first, and that AI is like at the core of the way business operates, it markets, it funds, it supports, it hires against, all of those pieces. I think that that's where a lot of startups, maybe see in this space that are doing that at the beginning. In terms of enterprise or large organizations, I think there's parts of that happening, but we're not necessarily seeing that. And I think it's for a lot of good reasons. There's risk. There's all these questions that we have about AI that we want to answer, and it's a little bit more challenging to do that when you're not at the early inception of an idea. So I think that is maybe just a reflection of where we are. But that aside, I think there are mindsets or ways to think about how do you take all these pieces of a business that are changing and put them back together a little bit differently. And that's sort of this crux of this disruption, is that all the pieces are the same, they just need to be put together differently. The one thing I think about and talk a lot about is even just the way that we approach a technology like AI and the language that we use. We often have talked about technologies of the past as tools, and they are one directional. We as humans interact, give direction, and we can kind of wield these tools in our path. I have gone on the record so many times, including national TV, saying technology is just a tool. I think we have to unlearn that, and I think that technology is actually a partner. And I think that is a big shift to make, is that it's not just this one directional sort of passive thing anymore. It is a relationship. And I think we should respond to technology in the way we would with any relationship. So first off, manage that relationship, set expectations, bring feedback. But I also think ask questions of it like we would in any relationship. Am I getting more than I'm giving, or equal? What is it taking from me? Like, are we clear here? And I think in organizations, how do we set accountabilities for AI, set targets, KPIs for AI? How do we build those relationships? And I think that is also very different. And so when we just think about it as a tool, we will stay, I think, at this sort of superficial level. How do I augment this? How do I automate this? How do I, in this one direction, where I do think AI specifically and Gen AI gives us an opportunity to open up a relationship where we can have that dialogue. And then I think, without getting too much into it, so the ethical considerations around this does make us then question, and I think have that important conversation and dialogue we need around risks and governance and all those pieces that we wouldn't maybe in the same way if we just think of technology as a tool.
It's an interesting conundrum in a lot of ways, because as I hear you speaking about not thinking about this, because I also often say we need to think about it as a tool or as a system and ask the same questions that we would have as a software system, maybe not as a hammer. Although I will say that, I expect a hammer to work a certain way. And if I hit certain things with, appropriate things with it, the head stays on the hammer and it does what it may be. But I think the risk when I hear you talking about, let's think about it as a relationship where there's sort of a give and take, it's really as a means to open up a broader set of conversations and a broader set of thinking about requirements and risk, as opposed to, I think when someone hears that, they might be then making sort of this jump to, like, you need to think of the AI system as a individual agent, sort of with its own agency in the world that's also, directing you. And I think could be rough, but maybe that's more from the user experience perspective and not really what you were getting at. So I struggle with that a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think that's fair. Not to think about it necessarily as another individual in a relationship, like, a spouse or a friend, but to think about it, at having some of those characteristics, right? I think is important, and also recognizing where we can co-create and collaborate and augment. And I think that, and for me, it's about opening up sort of that dialogue as well, right? And recognizing that it has a role and a place in work and in, whatever function it might be, and that we should be also expecting of it similar things, right? So we should, be providing its feedback. We should be, as you would with any team member, we should be thinking about not just delegating, but managing and being accountable and responsible for the outputs in that relationship as well. So yeah, I don't want people to walk away and think, it's a human and then a mind of its own necessarily. I think just the relationship, if we just think about it as one direction, and then don't put on it the same, expectations that we might, or we like leave it as a tool and don't think about management of it, don't think of, kind of the responsibilities it has, I worry then we just sort of missed the mark there. But yeah, that's a great clarification.
Yeah, well, this was in an earlier episode, we had the opportunity to talk with Marisa Schopp, who's a human machine interaction researcher. And she said, the language of relationships is more conducive to this discussion than the language that we use when we think about tools. So I think you're spot on there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly.
It's still a little bit tricky. And maybe this also comes down to that point, which is, you have to think about it as something that you're sort of getting something back from. And it's not that different in some ways from other computer systems. Maybe it's a recommender system, something like that. You choose to select it or follow its recommendation or not, and then it adjusts, right, based on the data. But particularly with the language component now, it feels different. But perhaps the other component of that is that as designers or the folks who are architecting the fundamental systems, the foundational models, those bits, they need to ensure that they're not pretending this thing is human, right? And using that. It's more about the interaction model on the relationship language than it is on the design of the system itself, because it's not going to self-correct. It's not going to do these things.
Yeah. And I think for those of us that are like working, building, or living with AI and Gen AI, let's use an example, like that in the last couple of years has just changed dramatically. Like we know that AI has been around for a very, very long time, and components of it. And so it's predictive analytics and some of the base of it. But I think for those that are living, especially those that are living and working with it, it's just recognizing a bit of a shift there than we would have with a search engine typically, or even a recommendation engine. Like there is more there. And so I think thinking about that mind shift, and in organizations, you've got such a diverse group of team members, people who are technical, who are building the technology, but vast majority of us are just trying to figure out like how this all makes sense and how we interact and live with it. And so I think it's just a reframe. Technically, it is a tool, I guess, if I was to look up the definition. I think for me, though, it's just that reframe to recognize that you can expect of it, and you also need to interact with it a little bit differently. Like I think your prior guest, the relationship and the language of a relationship, as opposed to just a one-dimensional or one-directional or sort of passive tool.
Mm-hmm. It opens up the ability to have a better conversation too about, as there's lots of good people in the world, they might not all be good for you. Is this healthy or unhealthy? Is it helping us get to the objectives we want, regardless of how, impressive its capabilities may seem to be?
Totally. And also like, are we getting what we need from it? And like, is that enough? And I think especially as we think about the skills piece and that transformation that's happening and the augmentation of it and, how it's going to support us. Like, I think we should be asking questions of technology as well. Like, is it giving more than we're getting? Which is like probably a whole other conversation.
Yeah, but so you mentioned skills. There's a lot of conversation. Again, let's sort of put out there and assume that people are rethinking their sort of the ingredients of the cake and taking that step back and looking at business strategy and process more holistically. And this conversation about reskilling or upskilling is then coming along with it. You have put forward or hypothesized, I think hypothesis is maybe not a strong enough word, that we need to also rethink a bit about or transform the process of skill acquisition, of learning, and specifically what you mentioned a little bit earlier, unlearning. Yeah. What is unlearning? And why does it matter?
Yeah, that's a good point. So I went after this experience I had at summer camp. I sort of dedicated the last decade to trying to answer this question, right? Like, why do some people in orgs thrive during periods of technological change and others don't? And I went to a few different places. So kind of academia or like the research on this. I went through experience teaching hundreds of thousands of people through our programs, working with teachers as an example, who are absolutely have had to change the way that they do their job, and started to sort of see how some of our prior models of learning maybe aren't complete. And I think the biggest thing for me, and the biggest kind of aha was actually, as I've shared before, is when I had my dad taught my dad how to use the adaptive cruise control in his car. Not an autonomous vehicle. It's funny. It's not an autonomous vehicle. We weren't even there yet, but it had a lot of those same components. And for me, watching him try to acquire the skills that were required in that, and to sort of make peace with this new technology, I saw within him this kind of breakthrough. He was holding on to so many of those existing ideas and beliefs and skills he had driving, right? It was so hard for him not to touch the wheel, and then, it would turn off, all those things, really simple. And so when I looked at the models of learning, we've got different T model, we've got learning curves. What I realized is that we have this basic belief, I think, many of us, that knowledge builds. That what we learn, our skills and our knowledge, it accumulates. And we're always learning new things, this notion of lifelong learning or learning organizations. We've been talking about that for decades as well. But there are some changes to technology. And there are certainly times, like right now, where I think that this notion that knowledge always accumulates and it never depreciates is missing the mark, because there are times where we need to let go of what way we've thought about something or a particular skill to make new for this disruptive technology, or the circumstances around that knowledge or the skill have changed so much. So when we think about technology skills, we know that the pace of those are changing very quickly. We also know that the half-life of these skills are shortening. So for most technology roles, it's 2.5 years, where half the role, skills, and knowledge is obsolete. And so how do we make space for that is this idea of unlearning in organizations and learning as individuals. And it's really trying to release those things that no longer serve you, those mindsets, that knowledge, the skill, to make way for new. Because I do believe that the circumstances around, Gen AI specifically, have changed so much that it requires us to unlearn and make space for thinking about the world and acting in a different way.
Mm-hmm. Now, to be clear, you're not talking about folks necessarily having to reinvent themselves every 2 years, or that we shouldn't develop foundational expertise, right? Just basic skills that build over time, or that there is no such thing as right expertise in the future. But so is there an example, because you've done technical training for a long time, and that might highlight that a bit more? Or even a non-technical example, frankly. Yeah.
And so I guess I have to be clear that I'm still a big believer in lifelong learning. I don't think we ever stop learning. So this idea of unlearning is not it's the only thing. It's really just an extension of learning. And so if you can think about a learning curve where you, at the beginning of learning something new, like a technology skill, you don't know anything. But over time, you learn more and more. What I'm suggesting is that we should also build in the acquisition of knowledge and skills, opportunities to question those best practices or those knowledge and those skills. And that is the unlearning piece. And I have some sort of suggestions that I think within skilling, within organizations, that are worth unlearning, some of the shifts or reframes that are worth doing. For me, actually, I see this all the time in teachers. I know I mentioned it a couple minutes ago, is that a lot of teachers will come to our programs, and they do that because they now have to teach with and about technology, like AI. And many of them would come to our experiences open-minded to wanting to learn, absolutely wanting to meet the students where their needs are, but we're holding on to this idea of being the sage on the stage or having all of the right answers. This is sort of the perfect example of this. Whereas there was another group of teachers that were like, I get it. They were willing to release that and were willing to see themselves as a learner in the classroom. And we'll be able to make such a foundational shift in the way that they thought about introducing these skills to students. And so that's an example of like everything you've learned in this career 20, 30 years in, you need to now unlearn and like relearn in this idea of lifelong learning, a new way of approaching the classroom. So that's an example I give. But there are, in organizational settings and particular technical skills, there's lots of other ways or things we want to question that may not serve us into the future.
So when you look at from the perspective of an organization or a corporation looking to acquire, extend, and leverage things like AI, are there 2 or 3 top shifts that you think need to be made that are fairly consistent in your experience?
Yeah, things worth unlearning. I think, definitely. I think there's one, which is just the way that we approach learning in organizations. Like often you have a learning function in an organization and it's separate from the business function and it may support, but when technology skills are changing so rapidly, I really believe the ownership of that learning should happen within the business function. And then the learning function can support with maybe how to best help people learn, but not what to learn. And so that's sort of unlearning the structures of how we've thought about training is one really great example. I think really broadly, just having a perspective of challenging best practices across the board is really important, right? When we look at organizations that have made digital transformation shifts and those that haven't, we look at GE and Siemens are often great examples we think about in the last decade or so. Those that have successfully made it, Siemens really was willing to, again, challenge best practices, build this sort of culture that was willing to fail forward. And so I think that's another really important, a place to unlearn is like really think about prioritizing and valuing doing things differently. And how do you come up with the structures and incentives to do that? And then I think really tactically how we talk about like learning. Also, it's often number of workshops delivered, how many trainings have your staff gone through, the number of hours and courses. We need to move to the outcomes, not just the outputs, but the outcomes. And so unlearning the way that we talk about it, talk about enabling the workforce of the future as opposed to training, like all these small little really tactical pieces, I think are kind of some of the recommendations I would have. So everything from broad question best practices to rethinking about your, the roles and responsibilities of your training function to just the way we talk about learning, I think can have a big shift in the big shift that organizations are going through right now.
Mm-hmm. We've talked in the past about we have a lot of risk management in organizations and the idea there is to minimize, if not to avoid risk in all things, including some of our transformative efforts. Is that focus on risk holding us back in some places as well?
Yeah, I think it reinforces the status quo in a lot of ways, right? And there's an element of pace, and I guess I don't want to knock like risk management or mitigation. I think it's super important, and we need those diverse perspectives. But this is also something we need is more diverse perspectives, right? So like questioning those components, and so bringing people together, like reducing silos. I know is the thing we all want to do in organizations, and some organizations are structured intentionally to create silos if we think certain industries. But I think, bringing those people together is like one really great way to help us unlearn, right? Challenge things. So I think it plays an important role, but does it reinforce the things that we've always done or the way we've always done it? Yes, absolutely. We see that. But we see organizations that are able to counter that, right? We've seen organizations that have, like done things that would be considered like radical. You think about IBM, a decade or so ago that trained their workforce on design thinking and nobody thought they could do that, but they just did it. And so the other thing when we study disruption, specifically the supply side or architectural disruption in which the way that you run your business, the way that you manufacture or offer your services is changing so drastically. Some of the really important things for organizations to do is to establish a really strong culture, right? And this is, again, from a research of a scholar, Joshua Gans, it's like really ensuring that there is a strong identity, strong culture, there's a focus on failing forward. And so risk is important, but there's ways that we can continue to move forward and not let that hamper progress.
Mm-hmm. And I suppose this harkens back to what you said at the top about what is it that we are focused on? What are we measuring? Is it, are we looking at ticks and tacks of the process? Are we looking at, I like the outputs versus outcomes. Although it strikes me again that we may, as decision makers, as leaders, even as individuals, have to take a really large step back to think about what is the actual outcome. Because thinking back to some of the projects I've done, as in my consulting days, I think I could think of a few examples where, again, the clients were focused on what we called outcomes, but were really just outputs.
Outputs. It's so much easier to focus on the outputs, right? It's so much easier to measure the outputs as well, especially when it's hard. At any time, it's hard to see into the future. But I think especially right now with the rapid pace of change and so many leaders and so many employees, it's hard to picture what comes next, right? It's hard to even think through that. And so, I kind of appreciate and understand why we do that. I think it's, our responsibility. And if we really want to meaningfully leverage the power of these technologies and help people make the shift, pushing through that, and working through that, I think is going to be really important.
So are there specific recommendations or things you would tell leaders about how they can help raise the organization's, gaze, if you will, the competency in this regard, at the same time as they do still need to operate, the business as it is?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the strategic clarity piece is the most important, right? I think that's probably could have this conversation on a lot of different topics. Understanding that is going to be really key. Then the second thing, and again, my bias here on people and organizations and the skills folks, but really engaging teams along the way. I think that's the other thing we've unlearned. We've typically thought about workforce development, maybe even top down, where there are organizations like a large automotive manufacturer making a shift from a diesel engine to electric said, you aren't going to be needed anymore. But that doesn't mean we're not going to support you to find what you're going to do next. And I think this is an opportunity, no matter how large your organization or how small, is to engage the people that are being impacted and helping to come up with those solutions as well. And I know there's some logistics challenges to that, but I mean, even at an individual team level, letting that cascade up, I think there's an enormous amount of opportunity there. These are people. Organizations are people, and these skills and the transformation of these technologies are impacting people most. And so I think engaging them in the solutions is going to be really important as well.
I was asked a question recently that really struck me, and it was phrased in this way. As AI takes over more jobs and functions, do managers need to become more skilled and creative in managing basically the machine? And I have a sort of gut level negative reaction to that. But my response really is, no, the task of managers moving forward and leaders is not to manage the AI. Our task is to figure out and value the human resource and the human skill and the human ingenuity, and figure out where we can apply those to get value and drive the next innovation with the human labor. Now, as Simon Johnson, reminded me and reminds all of us recently, that is not the commercial logic right now. But I do think that is the challenge if we want this AI-driven transformation to result in sort of a net better world, and one that really does value humans. Is that also, what's your reaction to that? And is that a mind shift we have to have as well?
Yeah, I think I would have the same reaction to you initially, which is I think that we aren't going anywhere. And maybe there's a bit of an oversell in some ways of this, this doom and gloom existential crisis or the robots taking over jobs. I feel like we've been talking about that for a very, very, very long time. But I do think the people element is so important, helping people navigate that shift. And ideally, if we think about technology also in this relationship, this augmentation and this co-creation, it will allow us to focus on doing the things that we want to be doing in more meaningful ways. Is there this messy middle that I think we're in? Absolutely. And we're us moving through. But if we don't keep an eye on that, if we don't, again, think about unlearning and recognizing that we need to think bottom up as much as top down, especially with workforce training and development, skills training, I do think we're going to miss the opportunity there. I think people are core to this, and engaging them meaningfully in the future, it's going to be great. I think we'll get through the messy middle and it will be great. We just need to support, and as leaders and as organizations, how are we doing that? And how do we need to rethink some of the ways our organizations have set up ourselves to kind of reinforce the systems that aren't going to allow us to make those shifts? And just what is that in your day-to-day that's worth rethinking?
Is there a question or a dimension to this conversation that folks like myself are just not asking, or you're like, please just ask that question or raise this point for discussion?
That's such a good... Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think for me, the kind of one thing that I like to take away or get people to think about, and maybe this is what you're asking, or I'm going to at least offer, is yes, I've talked about how technology, AI is different, it's disruptive, how, maybe it's flour in the cake and not icing on the cake, but sort of fundamentally, the future, I believe, is made up of all the same things that the past has been made up of, right? It's people, it's business strategies, it's processes, it is technologies. It's just that we're putting them together, or we need to put them together a little bit differently. So it can often feel a little daunting, especially as we look and we can't see that far over the horizon. I believe it's all the same things. It's just trying to figure out what that new formula is going to be for the future. And for that, I'm really excited about that. Even as fast as technology is changing, we are just at the very beginning. And so there's so much possibility and opportunity there. We just need to be, I think, diligent and intentional about opening up those pieces and being willing to put them together differently. And if we do that in small and in big ways, I feel like we're just getting started. That's my big kind of takeaway. Yeah.
a practical technical optimist, which
yes, fair.
I've started saying that I think the only true optimists are actually skeptics, because they're working really hard to figure out exactly where, and because they want it to work, so they're spending a lot more time instead of just saying it'll all work itself out eventually. It's fine.
Totally, got to solve this.
Of course, it's going to do well. Back to that point you made earlier, which is they're putting in the work to figure out how this will all work. All right. Yeah. So any final thoughts or sort of words of wisdom, or, hey, here's the top one or two things as leaders, as decision makers, as folks in an organization being asked to adapt to these technologies, they should take away?
Yeah, I think, as much as I am a techno optimist to all of this, I do think the next step is just to be critical, to think critically, to challenge those practices. And it can be as big as small, bringing people to the table, bringing people impacted, but bringing diverse perspectives. These are the little actions that you can take. There are big ones around how you structure learning in an organization, but if you're not there yet, I think progress is an achievement. And so just to question that, right? Is this perpetuating the way that we've always done things? Even just recognizing that, or this tendency for organizations and change to just reinforce the way things have always been done. I feel like you're already in a mindset to move in the right direction. So that would be my takeaway, or my ask to folks that are listening, is to just think about that. Think critically about, all of the things that you're doing in your business or in your personal life, and what is something that's worth challenging and unlearning as you go forward.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Melissa. This has been awesome. And I love this idea of learning to unlearn, not just because the words trip off the tongue in such a nice little way, but it's something, since we've met, I've thought about even in my own life, because again, it's a lot of those things you just start to do instinctively and habitually, and don't think about a little more critically, and getting rid of what's not working and what's not serving you anymore. Really. And I also really appreciate in this conversation the reframing of that conversation around thinking about the technology, using the language of relationships, and that clarification that it doesn't mean that we should think of it as equal or like, but that it's really the language that allows us to open that conversation. So again, really enjoy the insights, and I appreciate the time, and hopefully we'll get you back here in the near future to talk some more about how we're doing.
I'd love that. Thanks so much for having me. It was great.
So to continue learning from thinkers and doers such as Melissa about the real impact of AI on our human experience, subscribe now.